Well, it's been a long time coming, but after 945 days and the sprinkle of that delightful homeland British weather, Lewis Hamilton returned to the winner's circle to take the British Grand Prix, and with it, another moment in history as well. The first driver to win 9 times at the same Grand Prix event. Fantastic for him. A late charge for Max Verstappen on the hard tyres. He overcame Lando Norris to round out the podium, 2nd and 3rd for those. And what was a very, very exciting race, and plenty of other narratives along the way for us to discuss after what was a brilliant return to Silverstone. Well, after that then, here is how the results look. Well, it was Lewis Hamilton, as we say, that won his 104th Grand Prix, started 2nd and finished 1st, a fantastic result for him. Max Verstappen coming home in 2nd for the Red Bull, Lando Norris in 3rd, disappointingly in fact for him in 3rd, Oscar Piastri also in the McLaren, he came home 4th. Then it was Carlos Sainz also getting the fastest lap. Nico Hülkenberg in the Haas came home 6th, Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso returning to the points consistently, 7th and 8th for them. Alex Albon getting some points for Williams in 9th, and Yuki Tsunoda rounding out the points in 10th place. Then it was Sargent, Magnussen, Ricciardo, Charles Leclerc down there in 14th, Bottas, Esteban Ocon, Perez in 17th, and Zhou Guanyu in 18th. Non-classified there for George Russell and Pierre Gasly. Well, joining me now to dissect all the action we saw from Silverstone, I'm delighted to have Haydn Cobb and Jake Boxall-Legge, aka, as we always say, JBL. Gents, how are you? First of all, Haydn, that was quite a race.
Yeah, thriller. One of the particularly good ones this year, which we've had a few, to be fair. It's good fun, and I'm all well here. Thanks. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm on holiday, but I go back tonight, so I'm getting the holiday blues. JBL, you don't want to see my swimming shorts one more time. Tell us how you're doing before we go into the Grand Prix.
Very well, Bryn. I think I would have needed them in Silverstone because obviously it was very wet, very windy. It was sort of like a kind of mid-February kind of day over the weekend rather than the July that it actually is. So it's been a bit of a weird weekend, but we were treated with a thrilling race. So it was nice to be back in Northamptonshire and enjoying the F1 hospitality and everything that has to offer.
Do you know what? It's really nice to do one of these videos/podcasts where I can see your faces, where it's one of the first times this season that we've all got kind of smiles on our faces because we witnessed something that was what we wanted to see. Haydn, you've just nodded to the fact it was a terrific race. I'm not sure if those are the words you used or I'm paraphrasing, but a terrific race. It really was a fantastic Grand Prix from start to finish. The rain plays a huge part, as it seems to regularly in Formula One whenever it makes an appearance. But what is it about Silverstone itself that keeps drawing on these decent Grand Prix?
Yeah, I think it's just one of those classic venues that we all love, and Formula One cars come alive, as I think probably the cliche goes. You've got that mix of high-speed corners, now with the sort of changes from about 10, 15 years ago, mixed in with a few low speeds to provide a bit of variation. And it's a real test of tyres as well. That provides variation within the strategies. Granted, obviously, with the rain coming in, that threw a whole other curveball too, which is a fairly common feature of any British Grand Prix, you would say, over the years. And then add into just the legendary status that is Silverstone. I think if you asked what is an iconic Formula One track, you put Silverstone right at the top of the list alongside your Suzukas, Monzas and Spas. And it just combined all together with some Brits racing at the front as well, which is always exciting for us, just makes a perfect combination.
It seems to, doesn't it? I mean, like high tyre wear, the weather. I've got on my script here, solid burger options somebody's put on the script here. So, I mean, hospitality, you mentioned it, JB. Hospitality is the thing at Silverstone, but you don't have to be a high earner in a VIP area to enjoy some solid food options as well off track. But it is one of those locations, isn't it, JBL, that has high tyre wear. The weather does play a huge part in the Grand Prix, as we say. But it's one of those venues that seems to deliver more often than not.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because of, as Haydn said, that variation in corner type. There are sort of defined sectors where one team can be good and then a different team can be good in the next sector. And it really helps that this season's come alive, particularly. At the start of the season, it looked like 2023.2. That we were just going to go for another season of Verstappen and Red Bull dominance. But actually, now they've kind of hit a very clearly defined ceiling in their development. That's allowed the other teams to catch up sort of almost instantaneously, really, just at this point in the season. McLaren then came to the fore. Mercedes has sorted itself out. Ferrari has taken a backward step, but we know why, and the team knows why, and it's sort of taking one step back to maybe go 2 steps forward later on this season. So it's all shaping up very, very nicely. Who'd have thought we'd be saying this at the start of this season? I'm just happy that we've got a little bit of, that we've had 6 different winners in the first 12 races, which is, not a lot of seasons have had that. So it's nice to have that.
Yeah, and we haven't even touched on who did what, where and why, apart from the rundown of the race result itself. But let's talk about the conditions then. The weather, as I mentioned, plays a huge part in Formula One. And when it is as unpredictable as it sometimes is at Silverstone, and the sprawling nature of Silverstone as well, it's quite flat, but you seem to get sometimes weather pockets around the circuit. And that's very tricky for the teams and the drivers. When do you make the calls moving from tyre to tyre to tyre? And it plays into the hands and out of the hands of certain drivers at certain times. And then you've got the characteristics of the different sectors as well. But one guy who is always very, very good, no matter what the conditions it seems to be now, is Max Verstappen. He's really become that lead driver, hasn't he? He's a multi-champion, as we know. Lewis Hamilton's very good in the rain too. But with that in mind, Max Verstappen was expected to do pretty well at Silverstone with the car, with him, with the weather, etc., but didn't quite go according to plan, although I'm pretty sure he was happy with his podium, his second place there, JBL. What is going on at Red Bull, because they aren't seeming to be delivering what we were expecting them to deliver on a whole?
I think it's an interesting one. I think, let's start with qualifying, because I think it sort of pays to be aware of the quite a big error that Verstappen made. Followed his teammate off into the gravel at Cobb's corner. Unlike Perez, didn't beach himself, managed to kind of escape, but he caused quite a lot of damage to the floor. So that kind of sapped away at his qualifying performance. So it was a possibility. I think 100 points of downforce was cited, which had come down because Red Bull had sort of taken out some of the damage and done a few quick fixes to the floor by the time of the next qualifying session. But 100 points of downforce is about a second. If you imagine maybe they'd got it down to about half, that's half a second in lap time. So he would have been a contender for pole. Obviously, Red Bull were able to change that because part of FIA regulations, as long as you change something to the same spec, then it's absolutely fine, as long as the FIA agrees. But there just seemed to be this lack of tyre preservation ability throughout the laps. Verstappen had a great start to the race, and it's, he's got such brilliant car control and positioning, and he knew exactly where to put his car through the loop. It's one of those sort of switchback corners where there's a couple of lines through it, and he picked the right one to overlap Lando Norris. So that was a really good, move from him at the start of that race. But the thing is, he couldn't kick on. He couldn't keep pace with the two Mercedes, and perhaps every time he tried, he had to kind of come off the gas a little bit because his tyres were wearing at a rate that theirs weren't. And Red Bull hasn't explicitly said why. I think it just believes that it hadn't managed to keep its tyres in that performance window throughout the whole of the race. They just kind of missed that with its setup. So that was perhaps why Verstappen started to fall back rather, and then being overtaken by Norris, overtaken by Piastri, nearly overtaken by Sainz. He's just falling back, and he didn't really want to fight it because he didn't want to take more out of the tyres. So that was defining of his first stint, and it was sort of almost the same in the intermediate stint. We'll get onto this in a bit, but Red Bull did get that call right, and Verstappen made up time, but then started to fall backwards again. And it was only George Russell retiring that kind of let him off the leash a little bit, because I think it could have, potentially been worse for him. So it wasn't a particularly good day in terms of performance, but as we'll get on to, strategy calls were spot on, and Verstappen pretty much got everything out of it. So I think he over-delivered, to be quite honest. Red Bull was looking at about P4, P5, and he managed to get P2 out of it. So he did a fantastic job.
Is it a concern for Red Bull that they are struggling to get these tyres into the performance window? I mean, Horner is admitting that they are struggling with that. But are they able to understand what's going on with the tyres? Or is it completely, lick your finger and stick it in the air and see which way the wind blows?
The thing, all of these teams have got highly sophisticated tyre models. So basically what it does is it kind of predicts, let's say, the range of grip that a tyre is going to give at a certain load, determines kind of where your slip angles and things like that, and where grip starts to depreciate. So everybody's got that. and they're all very, very advanced. So Red Bull kind of have some idea of where it needs to be with regards to its tyre preparation and setup and that kind of thing. I just do think that it got it wrong. Obviously, there's a big range of high-speed corners that Red Bull's very, very good in, because they've just got that stability with their underbody. Suspension runs very, very stiff, which makes it very difficult for the street circuits, but it makes it very good at flat circuits like Silverstone. So it should have been able to take advantage of that. There is an element of sticking your finger in the air and sort of having to fill in the gaps. It's not perhaps quite as arcane as that, but you do have to sort of, let's say, extrapolate from incomplete data. There is a little bit of a weather-affected nature. Some teams get it very, very right. Other teams get it very, very wrong. Red Bull got it a little bit wrong. But again, as we'll come on to towards the end of the race, actually it got itself into a decent window.
That particular dynamic for Red Bull was their massive, massive strength for the past 2 years. And you would say that whenever Verstappen was running away at the front on those countless races over last season and the season before, he could put in the lap time at will. He was able to basically preserve that tyre, and then if the situation demanded it, pull out a lap that no one could beat, and he would do that to get the fastest lap later on their own, just showing how much of a margin he had. And it does seem that, at Silverstone, it was certainly the case. Imola looked a little bit like that when Norris was chasing him. They're getting it slightly wrong here and there this year with this year's car. And I think coupled with that, it is fair to say that Red Bull's rivals are getting on top of this issue that they were really far behind on in previous years. McLaren obviously have been probably their biggest challengers of late, but at Silverstone it was Mercedes that seemed to be on the whole getting it right and getting it in the window. And I think that's the two effects coming together really demonstrate that this is why we have a much more open season, it seems.
Yes, the laws of diminishing returns and convergence, all those words we like to use, that as you develop a car, the 1% gains become smaller so the teams around can start to close up a bit. But we haven't really even touched on Lewis Hamilton just yet, and we're going to briefly mention what a fantastic result that was for him. As a 104th Grand Prix victory. He had to wait 945 days since his last win back in 2021, the penultimate race. 56 Grand Prix between his last win and that Grand Prix. That's a huge number. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have been expecting that as well. And he gains 9 victories at the same Grand Prix, the only person to ever achieve that sort of result. But Lewis Hamilton's teammate, that's George Russell, won in Austria, start the car on pole at Silverstone. He was unfortunate that he had to retire the car. We'll come down to the reason for that as well, if we could, in a few moments' time. But he seemed to struggle where the others didn't when the conditions changed. He struggled where Lando wasn't struggling, maybe even Piastri wasn't struggling. Lewis certainly wasn't struggling out there. What was the reason for George's struggles, do we think, when those around him weren't?
It's fair to say that when that first rain shower, which was arguably probably the trickier in terms of driver control and gauging conditions because they were still on the slick tyres, he was at the front of the pack. He was the one finding how the conditions had changed, what the track surface was like first every time. Whereas, at least in that very first few laps of that rain shower, Hamilton had him as a reference point. Therefore, Norris had him as a reference point. So there's a little bit of mitigation for that. Then, you're right, as you've alluded to, the sort of the tyre performance, keeping the tyre in the window with the change of track surface condition. It seemed that the McLarens, as a pair, seemed to be on top of that in that first rain shower, way more than the Mercedes pair. We saw Russell and Hamilton almost in formation go off at the first corner when the rain was a little bit heavier, and when that all played out, that basically gifted Norris second because he got ahead of Russell, and then it wasn't for long after that he was able to get through past Hamilton. So Russell obviously was gauging conditions, losing tyre temperature, but then not too long after this, and who knows, maybe it was sort of connected to that. We'll see what Mercedes say when they've properly investigated it. There was a report of a water system issue with his Mercedes car. He said about 10 laps before he eventually had to retire the car, which, given he had I just double check before we started this, he had 6 laps on the intermediate, so 4 laps before his pit stop, which was around this sort of window, is that was clearly an issue he was dealing with, and so you could say, yeah, sort of tyre life's gone out there, but if he was trying to then maintain and manage a car issue as well, those two things will certainly keep you a little bit busy behind the steering wheel. He was still in a good position to be fighting for podiums for that win, had the car been able to make it to the finish. But yeah, naturally devastated. He still is yet to stand on the British Grand Prix podium. Obviously, Hamilton's got 9 wins and a few more podiums. Norris has been on that podium twice, so he's probably feeling it a little bit. But yeah, when the car gives up on you, there's not much blame that Russell can really be given on that one.
It was interesting, wasn't it, in commentary? I don't know which commentator or which team you were listening to. Even if you're a second behind the lead car, that 1 second, the position of the car, the orientation of it, the angle of the car, everything like that, gives a driver, even with just 1 second, it gives them that extra bit of knowledge going into the first turn. And there's George ploughing through it all and laying the foundations and setting the seed. So setting the scene. Sorry. So it's interesting. I mean, maybe we should hopefully to see George Russell on a podium at British Grand Prix very, very soon. I'm sure it will happen, particularly with Mercedes and the upturn of form. And I'm sure Lewis Hamilton's peeking over the fence at Ferrari thinking, oh, have I made the wrong call now? But what about the race itself, JBL? It was intriguing, wasn't it, with just how much the pace differed during the different conditions, the changeable conditions between the different top teams. What would be the cause? Because we get to this sort of stage in the season, don't we, where we expect pretty much each team to perform in roughly the same sort of ways in similar conditions, but it wasn't like that at Silverstone.
No, it was. You had 3 distinct phases of the race that therefore you had 3 different teams. I guess having the quickest car in each of those phases. So I think let's just sort of go through it at the start. That dry tyre phase at the start, Mercedes 1 and 2 led away from everybody else. Clearly managing their pace to a certain degree. As I understand it, Hamilton was managing his pace a little bit more than Russell. So just circling back to why Russell did start to lose pace before his water system issue. As I understand it, Hamilton kept a little bit more tyre life around him. So when the opportunity presented itself to overtake Russell, he had the tyres to do it. But yeah, they're clearly the fastest car in that frame of reference. As we've already alluded to, Red Bull struggling with tyre preservation. Both Norris and Piastri did sort of come back into the race a little bit, and we're starting to see this a lot from the McLarens actually. If they lose position at the start, they do back off and start to manage a lot more than everybody else around them, and that gives them a chance a little bit later on. But it's like and sort of topical almost. It's kind of like a little bit like watching England play. If they don't, actually, even if they do score in the first 10 minutes or so, they just kind of sit back and invite the pressure a little bit and then go again a little bit later when they've got a little bit more energy. So that's kind of almost the McLaren MO here. So then it comes to the crossover point where the rain starts to fall. Everybody's still on slicks because the track isn't wet enough at that moment in time. Everybody's still got their heat in their tyres. But that's where the McLaren start to come back into it because their heat retention is a little bit better. Also, they're running a little bit more downforce as well because Mercedes took a little bit downforce off to try and contend for pole in qualifying, and potentially in the case of a dry race, that's what you would want around the Silverstone circuit. So that's why the McLarens hit the front, just simply had had more heat in their tyres, so they can attack more. Mercedes slip off a little bit, and then that compounds their misery a little bit because then they lose more heat, and so McLaren is a little bit further up the road. But then that switches again when you get to the phase where it's raining. It's raining a lot more. The intermediates are now the tyre to be on, and it's better for Mercedes at that point. And it's not a question of downforce. It's not a question of necessarily fire up or heat retention or anything like that. Looking at the data traces, I believe Hamilton is just simply a better wet weather driver than Lando Norris. And there's a couple of points that kind of, let's say, back that up. First of all, Hamilton has done a wet race here, and he's won a wet race here in 2008. And secondly, if you look at how he attacks the circuit relative to Norris, he seems to be minimising wheel spin at every conceivable opportunity. So what illustrates that? I think the main one that illustrates that is how Hamilton approaches Maggots Beckett's. If you look at his speed trace, he just carries a lot more through. He doesn't come in with as much peak speed, but he doesn't lose as much either. He just carries so much more, and so he gains about 2 or 3 tenths. And there's sort of, this is kind of the, I'll sort of do it for visually for those watching on video. So what you have is you're accelerating and you're off the accelerator, brake, accelerator, brake, accelerator, brake. There's 3 points at which you come off the accelerator and start to brake through during that complex. That's what Norris does. He comes off the accelerator fully and he's on the brakes, and he's back on the accelerator and then he brakes. That's great, but because of the torque of these powertrains, you're just going to invite a lot of wheel spin, so you're not going to have the traction out the corner. Hamilton never comes fully off the throttle. So he's accelerating, comes off the throttle a little bit while he's braking. By the way, anybody looking to do this in a go-kart at home, do not do it because you will break
I was going to say, if you even do that on a go-kart, karting track, they're just waving flags at you immediately, aren't they? No, oh, come on, I can carry more speed this way. Sorry, please carry on, JBL. Please
Lewis
carry on.
Hamilton does it, so I
yeah,
can
exactly.
do it.
Exactly, and he's all right, isn't he?
Well, this is how I found that out, because I used to notice that Michael Schumacher used to do it quite a lot. He'd be on the brakes, but he'd be blipping the throttle just to get the turn in to work. Anyway, so Lewis is off the throttle maybe about, I don't have the data up in front of me, but from memory, he's come off of it about 60%. He's on the brakes and then he's back on the throttle. So he's not wheel spinning as much because he's not, he's not retarding the car through engine braking or anything like that quite as much. Next phase, he's off the throttle a little bit more while he's braking, hits the accelerator again, and then he's off the throttle even more, but still not 100% off. And then he's back on it again. So he's just limiting that slip. He's limiting that wheel spin. And so you can see through that trace throughout the lap, he's just coming out onto the hangar straight with just so much more speed than Norris is. And so that's where you can see that difference in wet weather pace. So that's I guess the point of the crossover, where the Mercedes is quicker, and that's just through Hamilton's kind of experience navigating the circuit in the wet. And then, as we've kind of already mentioned, just to sort of cap it off, that final phase, it's dry. Hamilton and Verstappen get that pit call absolutely right, absolutely spot on. If anything, they might have been able to do it in a lap earlier, which just refutes that previous point, but they get the call just right. The thing is, they were expecting the track to be a little bit wetter than it was. It wasn't as wet as it was. It was drying up very, very quickly. I think I think Red Bull probably knew that through its earlier experimentation with Sergio Perez, which is why Verstappen went onto the hards. Hamilton went onto the softs, and Norris basically copied what Hamilton did. We'll discuss this in a minute, I'm sure. But McLaren did have a set of mediums available, so it did shoot itself in the foot massively.
I thought that was a bit strange, actually. We will definitely, I'm sure, talk about that. But the fact that even on team radio, they were saying, we've got mediums, Lewis has got hards and softs or something, I think it was the call. And so we thought, okay, McLaren are going to go onto the mediums. That's the right choice. And they went soft. It was, well, we would definitely talk about that. But Haydn, just stay on the McLaren theme. You could bring the tyres in if you want to in just a few moments, go with wherever you want. But it did seem a bit scrappy from both Lando and Oscar. They almost promised that they could perform brilliantly and get a great result. And it looked like they could. But then it was a bit scrappy, particularly off the start. Lando Norris, off he went. He kind of went a bit deep, didn't he, into turn 3. That allowed Max to close in on him as well. What was going on there with McLaren? Because they are getting so close to being a very, very good team, aren't they?
Definitely. And I think, there's as we allude to, particularly with the pit stops and calls there, that's where the critical mistakes were made, and where McLaren you would argue, have lost this race. But yet, at the start, sort of looking back on it, Norris was basically looking for an overtake on Hamilton going into those first corner complexes, looked away and ran outside. Hamilton shut the door, therefore making him go the long way around, and Verstappen said, thank you very much. It was a risky move, obviously, like not in terms of damage or anything like that, but for position. But you want your driver to be going on the attack and in the first few corners for the first lap. Just Otherwise, what are they doing there? So I feel like, yeah, sure, he lost position, but then as we saw with tyre management and the McLaren performance in that first stint, got past Verstappen with a very, very good move, a quick move, and then Piastri followed through just as the rain was arriving. So he had a bit of a hairy moment coming through Stowe whilst going Verstappen. It looked like he was just going to carry on into the wall, but no, kept his car under control. And yeah, I think it's like because they've surged through in that rain shower to a 1 and 2, and it was, yeah, sure, it wasn't a flawless performance up to those pit stops, but I thought on the whole they were putting together a decent race. And you could say that in some parts almost too good to extent, because they had the cars double stacked, as it were, and therefore they had to make a choice whether to bring Norris and Piastri together or not, as Mercedes did, and as I'm sure we'll go on to now. That's sort of where their race properly started to unfold.
Well, let's move on to it straight away, shall we? Let's unpack this, because I think at times, I mean, McLaren is sometimes doing that uniquely Ferrari thing of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, should I say. And they did look a bit panicked at time. They didn't double stack when other teams double stacked. That put Piastri out of position. There were some other decisions along the way that didn't seem to be right. Tyre choice, lapping too late. And Lando Norris, JBL, was critical of the team and himself in his decisions, and they need to go and unpack that. So, talk us through the decisions they made, why they didn't go for the double stack when, say, Mercedes did.
I think it was, and this was something Andrea Stella said, they just got a little bit greedy. I think that they thought that they could beat the rain and hope that Piastri was able to kind of cycle round, maybe not lose as much as he would for the double stack. Ultimately, that proved to be a little bit trite. Actually, what they should have done is asked Piastri to back off slightly so that they could do a double stack. He'd still come out ahead of the Mercedes duo, and McLaren wouldn't lose. Well, he wouldn't lose time basically being in the box while they're getting the right tyres out. So I think getting the right delta would have been the smart option there. But again, as Stella said, just got a little bit greedy, didn't really react to it in time. So that was the reason behind that. And then obviously Piastri lost a lot more time than he'd gained, so he was out of the reckoning for race victory. So that kind of compounds itself, because then McLaren's only got one horse in the race, and obviously Mercedes did eventually too, but that wasn't through any fault of their own, really. But then just going on to the decision for slick tyres as well. Piastri was offered the choice and he said mediums immediately. I think he knew that the circuit was drying out a lot quicker than people thought it was. Medium was absolutely the tyre to be on at that point, and if you had a set of mediums, why wouldn't you put them on? McLaren went to Norris with the choice and he said softs, and then as he was coming into the box he then said mediums, but by that point it was too late. McLaren's instinct was to go for mediums for him as well. So what it needed to do was just make the call, put him on mediums, and if the decision is wrong, that's on them rather than on both sides. So that's, obviously hindsight is 2020, and we can talk about, McLaren should have gone on mediums all day long, but that was their instinct and they just didn't follow through with it. It's just this sense of a continuing reaction to things rather than being proactive, which is what Mercedes did, which is how Mercedes won the race. Being proactive was sort of what Red Bull did as well with regards to its own pit strategy, to a certain degree at least. Verstappen was still shadowing Hamilton into the pits anyway, but there's just that reactiveness. And again, we saw it in Montreal, where McLaren didn't react quick enough to the safety car and Norris lost the lead. And we're seeing it again. There just seems to be this, and it's been so long since McLaren was a championship winning team. I would say probably 90% of the staff that were there when McLaren was last a championship contender are no longer there. So the team needs to learn to win again, pure and simple. And it's won a race this season, but doing it regularly is a very different thing indeed. And that's what Red Bull seems to be able to do week in, week out. That's what Mercedes has been able to pick up from again. Now that they've got the car to do it, they know exactly what to do in that situation. McLaren doesn't know how to do that, and it needs to learn to do it very, very quickly.
3 or 4 occasions, isn't it, this season that McLaren have come very, very close to a victory, and it's come down to a bit of an error, maybe a tyre choice or something along the way that's just taken it away from them ever so slightly. But Haydn, let's talk a little bit about Red Bull then. We'll talk about Checo, his woes, but I'm not going to pick on Sergio Perez at all, because there's been reports that he's got the yips, and if you don't know what the yips are, look it up. It's a term that basically means your ability to perform the function that you need to perform your sport is completely gone. It happens in tennis a fair bit, doesn't it? We see it, and it always happened in my football career as well. I suffered the yips without realising it. I was just useless, but that's another matter. But with Red Bull then, Sergio Perez, Checo is very much struggling psychologically, it seems, as well. So we'll talk about that. But what about Max as well? He seemed to not quite have the pace to start with, but he had that patience and that resilience. And then when it came to him, he had that clinical ability that we know he has to deliver and get himself back up, finishing second overall.
Yes, you could say some parts of the performance at Silverstone for Max Verstappen was very un-Verstappen-like, because I say this jokingly, really, but there was no sort of late lunges, no sort of defend at all costs that we saw a little bit at Austria and such like. I think because he knew that banking the points on this occasion was probably going to be his best bet. And look, let's be honest, second place at the British Grand Prix with Hamilton finishing ahead of him is probably the best outcome he would have envisaged in any scenario of how that race played out, given the context Hamilton being so far back in the championship, not a title rival at this stage. His biggest concerns are Norris and Leclerc. And obviously Leclerc was nowhere, which we'll get onto a little bit later, and he finished ahead of Norris. So yes, the performance there was extracted. There, as we mentioned earlier in this chat, that they did not have the quickest car, and they've made a sort of didn't quite get the tyres in the right windows and that. But I think generally he managed to extract what they could, and I think they made near perfect calls on what they had in terms of when to come in. They didn't have that magic set of medium tyres that McLaren decided to pass over for Norris, but went on the hards, knowing that track was drying out, knowing how many laps were there, and the soft would start to fall away, which Norris suffered with. Meant that he could go on the attack. And okay, it never works out like this, because races are predetermined in terms of how many laps I needed to complete a Grand Prix, but a couple more laps and he would have potentially got Hamilton at the end. So I generally think from his point of view he'll go away. Yeah, sure, he always wants to win. That's what Verstappen's are built to do, but a healthy haul of points extends his own drivers' championship lead. Yeah, I think he did what he did. And now let's go on to Sergio Perez. We'll start obviously with the qualifying Q1 off at Copse, which ended his qualifying before he even really got going, and he started what would have been 19th, but ended up being put into the pit lane because of basically a free power unit change and a few other bits. But even then, trying to fight through the pack just didn't have the pace, and became a little bit of a guinea pig, I think, for Red Bull in terms of just gauging tyres and gauging conditions. He was one of the few drivers that went to the Inters early, which deemed too early, and obviously that was clear, but for at least for everyone else on the grid, and gave Verstappen good lead. And he also started on the hard tyre, and so therefore had a good read, granted with a much higher fuel load, but had a good read of how that tyre would perform on the track. So Verstappen could, or Red Bull as well, could have confidence of that pick for the final stint. Does that help him and his situation? Not in the slightest. Yes, there's this talk of performance and contract clauses of being 100 points behind Verstappen triggers some sort of potential for him to being ousted. It sounds like from the latest that we've heard from the ground that they're very unlikely there'll be a change between now and before the summer break. You would say Perez seems, famous last words, because we know how these teams operate, but seems to have at least 2 more races of basically redemption to go for. But there's that huge element of Lawson's testing in the RB20 at Silverstone for the filming day, which is it was impossible to make comparisons, but it does mirror what Ricciardo went through last year, and De Vries being axed at what was AlphaTauri, now RB. So the pressure's on him. He, as you're totally right. He's It looks devoid of confidence and devoid of performance right now. And if it costs Red Bull the Constructors' Championship, that this is exactly where they lose it. These sorts of races, this sort of run.
Yeah, and I urge anyone to go to Autosport magazine, autosport.com probably is the best place to go actually, and check out the article by John Noble, which is about this clause in the contract. So if you want some background on it, essentially it's saying that sources are saying there's a clause in Perez's contract that says if he falls behind Max Verstappen by 100 points or more at key phases in the season, so the summer break or the end of the season, then they could essentially get rid of him. They could cancel that contract, and he's currently sitting a whopper, as you say, behind right now, and the gap is only growing. So I think everybody really wishes that Sergio rediscovers some form of form. Just from a human side of things, it's just not nice to see somebody struggling the way he is with all the media speculation and these conversations that we consistently have. And let's hope next time out he can actually pull a rabbit out of that hat and get a result from the car. What about strategy then, JBL? Red Bull, Max said they were pretty much on it. They pretty much got everything right from his point of view. You have alluded to it already when they moved on to the tyres and the tyre choices that they made.
Yeah, when it was the time to switch to Inters, got it absolutely right. And yeah, sure, they'd used Perez as a bit of a guinea pig. But the time was then. They could afford to take a little bit of a gamble because just Verstappen was falling behind. He had Sainz all over him at this point, so they might as well take the jump, and they did it. Right time to do it. And then when it came to coming off of the tyres, I think it was basically Mercedes made the decision to pull Hamilton in, and Verstappen was like, well, I'm going to follow him in, and basically said to Red Bull, we're doing it now. And again, that was absolutely the right thing. So it's just team and driver together in perfect unison, calling the shots and making it work. So that's basically the long and short of it. Called it absolutely right. Again, as Haydn has already said, they didn't have a medium tyre available, so had to get to the hard, which is probably the next best thing. And that allowed him to get ahead of Lando Norris, just because Norris uncharacteristically didn't actually manage to... I don't think he prepared the tyres properly. I think he tried to go flat out from the start of that stint. Obviously encountered it being less wet than I think people expected. And he just took the best out of them. I think probably Hamilton prepared his a little bit better, and that's why he was able to eke just ahead and ensure the gap was just about impervious to Verstappen's late race charge. So that's basically how Red Bull got it right. Obviously, kind of sacrificing Perez, got the strategy very, very wrong there, but I don't think that was their concern. And I just sort of want to cycle back to the earlier point about Perez. It's not surprising to see that dip in form where Red Bull essentially views him as essentially expendable for using him for whatever Max Verstappen needs. I don't believe for 1 minute that Sergio Perez is as bad as he's looking right now. I've crunched the numbers on this previously. Relative to a champion teammate, he's probably the most far back teammate to a champion we've had since Schumacher and his rotating cast of drivers in about 94, 95. But how much of that is actually Perez's worth, and how much of it is being put in positions that aren't good for him, or suffering these whopping losses of confidence, which has now happened in the last 2 years in a row. That that's not down to his driving. That's obviously something external. And the fact that it's happened a second time in a row after exactly the same race, Miami, that suggests that Red Bull is just managing him very, very badly indeed. And it clearly hasn't learnt how to get the best out of him. It took Perez until Qatar to be regularly back at the front, challenging for podiums and that kind of thing, and that's what got him over the line in second. So you kind of have to look at the team and say, obviously Perez is underperforming, and if it continues, then yeah, maybe at the end of the year he's not the right person to continue. But dropping him in mid-season, just to me, it seems ridiculous when you've offered him a new contract. And offering him that new contract was supposed to be, okay, Sergio, you're secure now, you can get your head back in the game. But all of these talks of performance clauses and that kind of thing, it's a sort of halfway house almost. So I don't really understand their management technique. I really don't. And it's very similar to the years gone by of if you don't perform, you're out. But there just seems to be no way for the driver to sort of be supported if they need it. If they are underperforming, they just sort of get thrown away like an old pen or something like that. And it just doesn't seem to be very fitting with it. You know, it's more reminiscent of running an F1 team in 1950s, not of 2024.
And I guess the other context on this is the replacement options for Red Bull. Nobody is a certain bet. Otherwise, let's be honest, it probably would have happened by now anyway. But Ricciardo is up and down with his form for RB and his overall comeback, and he was always tipped to be this. If Perez doesn't perform, he's the person we get in. You can't say that is the current situation. Curiously, Tsunoda, who has, you would arguably say, stepped up and probably is one of the leading candidates for that particular sort of fold, given he's been at that team, the junior team, for a few years now, and should follow the process of being then able to take the step up.
Problem there is Horner doesn't rate him.
No, exactly. So he's sort of stuck in no man's land within that organisation. Now Lawson seems to be a tip, and obviously to be fair, he performed extremely well when he was parachuted in when Ricciardo got injured last year. He's getting that RB20 filming day test, so could be an option, but that's not exactly a foolproof plan and has lots of elements to it that could go wrong. And then obviously you have the Max Verstappen factor as well of who does he ideally want as teammate? Does he want somebody that's going to challenge him or cause disruption or that, or does he want a proper number 2 driver? Carlos Sainz is still on this driver market, and he's holding out and waiting to see what options he can get, but it does seem like Red Bull will not go for him because of this previous bad blood and a bit of disruptive nature. So yeah, they if they looked outside of their stable, the best option is currently a free agent they don't want, and then it sort of really limits their other options. So yeah, it's a case of, well, we just need Perez to do the bare minimum and we'll keep him and that's fine. But if he isn't able to do that, then they've really sort of shortcut their options as well in terms of what they can do as plan B.
Well, 71 points is the gap now between Red Bull and Ferrari in second place. I mean, just on the Sergio Perez thing, it certainly doesn't help when you have someone like Helmut Marko chirping up with his very helpful comments all the time, which just seem to add more and more pressure onto Sergio Perez's shoulders. And, it's a big, big question mark. And as you rightly say, JBL, how helpful is it when, you sign a new contract, everyone said, okay, now Perez is secure. And then they go, oh yeah, but there are clauses, so we could get rid of him. It's brilliant. It's like being on a freelance contract where you get this lovely, lovely freelance contract that could be ended at the drop of a hat. And you think, oh, great. So I think with Perez, everyone just needs to breathe a little bit. He is a good driver. There's no doubt he's a good driver. Is he a great driver? I think we all know the answer is no, but he's a good driver and he's proven to be a good teammate, helping hand Max Verstappen that first title a few years ago. Move on to Ferrari very quickly, because when we talk about teams struggling, Lewis Hamilton, as we say, must be peering over that fence now with his eyes closed. One of them, at least one of them, tightly shut at the moment as well, because they had that upgrade. They've now gone back on the upgrade. Things are going wrong at Ferrari. They've just had an announcement of another team member leaving. Fred Vasseur is now going to fill that void as well. So what is going on at Ferrari, Haydn? It's another tough weekend. How many more can they have? Well,
yeah, it's very strange. You rewind the clock 6 weeks ago and Leclerc's winning the Monaco Grand Prix and the world is beautiful and wonderful at Ferrari. As it turns out, so their upgrades that arrived in Spain as their first race have not delivered, have not worked, and after doing back-to-back tests during practice at Silverstone, they've effectively taken them off the car and gone back to the Imola spec Ferrari that they had, which did generally was a step forward, but they've lost, to quote Carlos Sainz, 2-3 months of development time, and everyone else is able to make their gains, and that's sort of why they're dipping down behind McLaren and Mercedes, and it probably were still behind Red Bull at that point, but making them the fourth quickest team at the moment. And simply, they are now on the back foot to the rest of their rivals, which if they ever had any I think it was probably a long shot anyway, but if they had aspirations for a title fight this year, it's certainly been blown out the water now. So they've just got to get back on the development train, get on it forward. But obviously, like you say, there's changes afoot at Maranello. Yes, the F1 chassis technical director for Ferrari, Enrico Cardile, has left the team and is hugely expected to arrive at Aston Martin. And given Aston Martin's also just announced the signing of ex-Mercedes engine chief Andy Cowell, they're still strengthening their ranks week by week. In terms of how that impacts Ferrari short term, I think they're also going through those changes, and this is the nature of the game. People get poached, you poach people, but the timing is probably not ideal for them, given that the current situation that they're going through with their car. And it's part of it, and they had certainly a decent start to the year with a couple of wins, and things looked to be going on the up, and they've just sort of taken a backward step here. But that keeps it exciting, at least keeps us busy. So we'll see what they can deliver in terms of their next upgrades and whether that will work. There seemed to be some sort of thinking of but maybe the failed Spain upgrades might work at certain tracks. So we'll see if they can rescue any of those. But they've certainly got work to do.
Well, they're not falling down the order just yet. They're still second in the Constructors, but that gap is now 7 points between them and McLaren. And let's face it, they're sitting ducks right now. If they cannot get a handle of this in the next few Grand Prix, then just McLaren could swamp that and they could overtake. And Mercedes could as well. I mean, they're a decent haul behind, but 80-odd points or something like that, they could close the gap on too. Move on to another team, Ferrari engine maybe, I don't know. JBL, any other teams or any other drivers that caught your eye? I think that one of the Haas drivers in particular didn't he?
Yeah, Nico Hülkenberg was outstanding in Silverstone. Aside from turn 1, where turn 3 actually, he went off a little bit and caused a little bit of ructions in the ranks, but everything was fine. And he did very well to kind of atone for that, made his way back through the pack and scored 6th. Just a little bit of a peek behind the curtain for those listening, kind of wondering how an F1 weekend sort of pans out for us media. On Friday, we usually get 3 representatives from a team, and they'll do sort of a little bit of a show and tell, a little bit of a sort of scrum for amongst the media, and kind of explain new updates and that sort of thing. And this weekend, one of the people that we had was Luca Mattelli, who is the aerodynamics team leader at Haas. Luckily, they had a new upgrade for us this weekend, which involved the floor and a few other changes to the sort of bodywork around the engine cover as well. And Mattelli told us that this was kind of aimed at improving the high-speed performance of the car. It's been one of the weaknesses this season. I think it went to Barcelona in particular, not particularly hopeful of where it would get points. At Austria, it was a lot better, and Hülkenberg got 6th there, and now he's got 6th again. And he feels that the upgrades are really working. He said after the race that the car just felt really good. It felt like the team was making progress, and it just seems to be this change in mentality under Ayo Komatsu. This unity. It's very, very difficult to unite the Haas team because it's kind of scattered all around. You've got a base in the US, you've got a base in the UK, you've got a base in Italy that's basically a hub in the Maranello Ferrari factory. And he's got to basically ensure all of those parts are talking to each other, and they seem to be doing that now. And there seems to be just a much stronger idea of what the drivers need, and how to dial out the weaknesses of the car. Remember last year, for example, where they had that tyre preservation issue that was effectively, they would do a lap, the tyres would have overheated because the car would have slid too much. And so the drivers had to kind of essentially take themselves out of the race and back off massively just to make it to the end on what was a normal strategy. Now they've got a car that is a lot stronger, and something that the drivers can race with, and you're seeing the dividends being paid, and now they're just 4 points off of RB in the Constructors' Championship. RB's had a bit of a disaster over the last few races, trying to understand this upgrade package that they brought to Canada that didn't really work, and they're trying to sort of work out which bits work and which bits didn't. So yeah, it's all very sort of finely poised in that midfield battle. Other sort of things to mention: Aston Martin looked to be sort of back on pace. There's a new front wing there, and I think a lot of teams are costing onto the fact that the front wing's super important for this kind of ground effect style aerodynamics. Just sets up the flow underneath the underbody of the car so much more than perhaps under the old regulations it did. Obviously, it's still very, very important, but just for balance as well. It's something that teams are sort of finding. And Williams looked good as well. Alex Albon was very, very strong in that race and got 9th at the end. Nice little call from Williams there to put him on the medium tyre at the end. And that's what got him ahead of Yuki Tsunoda, who was 9th and then massively fell away because he couldn't preserve the tyres in that final stint. So yes, Aston Martin, Haas and Williams all having very, very good races and all very, very needed, particularly in that area of the championship.
Yeah, absolutely right. And as you say, the front wing's so important. I think Toto Wolff came out and said recently that it wasn't just this front wing on their car is now working better. They have a full comprehensive understanding of what's going on at Mercedes. It's all clicked into position finally, and they're seeing the benefits of all that. Look, gents, thank you so much indeed. I think we can all say that we've sat down and we've witnessed and now we've discussed what was, thankfully, a really, really exciting Grand Prix. So after the Silverstone Grand Prix, the British Grand Prix, here's how the championship standings look. Well, it's Max Verstappen that continues to lead the way, 255 points. He is ahead of, yes, Lando Norris, 171 for him. Charles Leclerc, 150, and Carlos Sainz on 146. Then it's Piastri, Perez, George Russell, and Lewis Hamilton getting that first win, as we say, in 56 Grand Prix. He's down there with 110. Fernando Alonso in 9th, Lance Stroll in 10th. Still yet to score, though. At the very bottom of the pile, you can see Zhou Guanyu, Logan Sargent, and Valtteri Bottas. And the constructors, well, that looks like this. Red Bull lead the way, 373 points, just 71 now ahead of Ferrari, who are only 7 points ahead of McLaren. Mercedes pulling up on 221 points now, and Aston Martin back in the points there on 68. Then it's RB, Haas, Alpine, Williams, and yet to score, it is Sauber. Well, that just about does it for our analysis of the British Grand Prix. And just as the sport gets into fever pitch, well, we take a week off before heading to Hungary and the Hungaroring and then moving on to Belgium and Spa. As always, thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe so you get all of our videos. And also don't forget to let us know in the comments what you think about the season and just how close it's getting. As always, as I say, thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.